are very happy to have with us our speaker today, the Francisco Javier Guerrero Aguirre, who is a counselor in the IFE, the National Federal Electoral Institute in Mexico, and who's also author of this brand new book. When it came out very recently, right?
Like a month ago.
A month ago. So this is brand new, first time it's here in the US. El voto de los mexicanos en el extranjero, the vote of Mexicans abroad. And we have really someone who's just an expert on that topic, but we're also asking him to broaden and talk not just about the book, but also a little bit about the political reform process and debate that's underway in Mexico right now. And there's some crossover between the two because one of the many topics that's being discussed in that is a reform of the process for voting abroad for Mexicans. Dr. Guerrero was ratified by the Chamber of Deputies to serve as Electoral Councilor from August 2008 to October 2013, so he's almost at the end of his term. And before being there, he's held several positions in the public sector. He served as the Director of the Social Studies and Public Opinion Center of the Chamber of Deputies, Chief of Staff of the Presidency of the Senate's Board of Directors, and National Subcommissioner in the National Commission of Medical Arbitration. So very shortly, in the next couple of months, he'll be moving on to new things. Although, we have on the table in the talk of political reform, possibly the creation of a new electoral institute, a new arbiter and administrator of elections in Mexico. So who knows where your future actually lies. Well, leave it to you. Thanks a lot for coming today.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I brought some books, so if you want a copy of the book, feel free to come and get it. It's for you. I would like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me here, particularly Christopher Wilson for introducing the book. I'm going to try to give a speech that is divided in two parts. One part is going to be related to the book, and the process for Mexicans who live abroad and how they can vote in Mexico and political reform that has to be taken in order to reform this model. And on the other side, I guess that you would be very interested in what's going on now in Mexico. Now we're having a discussion. It's quite possible that the Federal Institute, as we know it, the IFE, is going to be transformed into a national institute. That would mean, among other things, the disappearance of the local institutes. As you know, in Mexico, we have a federal system. The federal system is in charge of organizing the election for the members of the House, for the Senate, and for the President. But particularly the PRD and the PAN, the opposition parties in Mexico, they feel that it would be a good idea to disappear as such all the local institutes. I'm not that crazy about that idea. I don't know if it's a good idea, because I think that it's important in Mexico to build institutions in the states. But that's an ongoing debate, so I'm going to try to point out things on the two sides. And when we have the chance to have questions, perhaps we can deepen on this discussion. As you know, the creation of the Institute to Manage Elections, this is the Federal Electoral Institute known as IFE in Mexico, represented, when it was founded, a breakthrough for democracy. For the first time in Mexico's history, an independent agency of the government would organize elections. Progress was made in the autonomy of the Institute. Autonomy of IFE, I would say, it is the most important feature that gives the Institute the possibility of organizing elections and to build confidence among the electorate. Today, the Federal Electoral Institute of Mexico is integrated by Electoral Councilor citizens, which try to do their job with impartiality and professionalism. By the way, I'm finishing my work as a counselor on October the 30th. The same is happening with another 4 members of the council. So that means that if Congress fails in approving the nomination of the new councilors, that could mean that on November the 1st, that's my birthday, on November the 1st, it's possible that the council is going to work only with 4 members. That had never happened in the history of the Institute, but it's a possibility that could happen in the future. The federal election celebrated in 2006 was a hard test for the Electoral Institute. In the year of 2007, the Federal Congress promoted a pack of legal reforms and added new administrative and legal functions to the Institute. Today, the Electoral Institute manages official times on radio and TV and has the faculty to punish political parties with monetary fines and improper advertising. By the way, I brought another copy. I only brought 2 of them, but in the future perhaps we could talk about this book also. I prepared a book about the role of radio and TV in political campaigns that I guess also would be interesting for you to know in the future. It is important to note that in Mexico we have 32 local electoral institutes, 1 in each state. These institutes organize the election for governor, local congress, mayors, and local authorities. In the year 2012, federal election, this was the biggest Mexico's history. As far as we are aware, it was a clean and fair election in which the Institutional Revolutionary Party won by far. That, as you know, the difference in terms of votes between the President Peña Nieto and the second place, who was Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was more than 3.5 million votes. Back in Mexico, the political landscape has changed dramatically in the last election. Mexican citizens chose a plural Congress where decisions have to be agreed. Today, the political agreement between political parties established the route. The denominated agreement for Mexico, or called, as we call it in Mexico, Pacto for Mexico, was signed between the government and the leaders of political parties, where everyone is committed to measures to boost growth and development in Mexico. This Pacto for Mexico, Pacto por México, has been very important since December, because we could say that almost any reform in Mexico, particularly education reform, labor reform, reform in TV and media, was agreed among the 3 political parties. As you know, from 2006 and to 2012, the PRD didn't talk at all, at least officially, with the government. That changed dramatically on December the 1st. One of the agreements of this alliance, or Pacto por Mexico, that would be the point 5 to be precise, establishes the will to implement electoral reform to promote greater sanctity, transparency, and stability for the political system as a whole. It's also established the need for cheaper and crystal elections. To meet these objectives, the political agreement promotes the following objectives. And I'm going to mention just one of the few objectives of this agreement. This agreement is actually currently being discussed in Congress. The reduction and accountability of political party spending, the decrease in political campaigning spending, the review of official broadcasting times of television and radio, particularly controlling the use of advertisements. It's interesting to say that in Mexico, in the last election, one of the things that created controversy is that, according to some political parties, some media, they could sell interviews that should be part of journalism, but they were not being properly, professionally organized, but instead that they would receive money in order to give these interviews. This is a tricky thing, because for IFE it's almost impossible to prove if someone was selling or not selling this kind of interviews. It's also another one that is controversial is to forbid promotional items in political campaigns. That's small goods such as food pantries and supplies. Also to strengthen the law to prevent the use of illicit financial resources. And most important, and that this would be the core of the discussion, is to create a national election institute. Nowadays, IFE is a federal election institute. Now, particularly among the Pacto por México, they're trying to create a national election institute as an electoral authority responsible for organizing and managing federal, state, and municipal elections. The proposal provides the disappearance of local electoral organizations. This would mean, in many ways, that the states of Mexico wouldn't organize any kind of elections. Everything would be organized from the center. So the basis of these elections would be organized from Mexico City, and then the IFE would send delegates to all the states through the civil service. This important reform is being discussed during these days in Congress and completely changes the electoral structure of Mexico. This is, I would say, an ambitious political reform. The National Action Party, the PAN, proposes a voltage election for the presidential run, the second round of elections for president, governor, and mayor of Mexico City, and the left wing, the PRD, also proposes a legislative re-election. I would say that re-election is really close now. I can almost foresee that in the next, perhaps in this month or of next month, we would have re-election in the agenda. The bill suggests also the ratification of cabinet members by Congress, the appointment of the Republic General Attorney by the Senate, and the establishment of coalition governments. As you know, in Mexico it's complicated to work in Congress because the Congress is extremely divided, and to apply for constitutional reform is complicated also because you need 2/3 of the members of both houses to get constitutional reform. The reform of the Federal Election Institute is relevant. Currently consists of 9 councilors. Nowadays we're 9, well, we're 8, because there's one missing since February, but it has been very complicated to get agreement, and intends to expand its General Council to 11 members. This new institution will have to manage and organize elections for all states and cities around the country. It also aims to transform the Federal Electoral Court of the Judiciary of the Federation, and aims to erase state electoral courts. This is important as well because one of the intentions is that the TRIFE, the Tribunal Electoral Federal, would take care of the whole judiciary system, eliminating the courts in every state. So as you can see, it's a trend towards centralization and managing things, particularly from Mexico City. These transformations, along with tax and energy reform, as you know, tax and energy reform is now the name of the game in Mexican Congress. Everybody's talking about that, particularly now about tax reform. These reforms are today the most important legislative bills in Mexico. The proposal for a new electoral body with new tasks has heated the discussion. Yesterday, the members of the electoral institutes in all the states went to Congress to tell the members of the Senate that they feel that disappearing the whole structure of the electoral institutes in the states would be a historical mistake. So it's a heated debate in that part. The political elite, with every newspaper editorialist tasked about these changes every day, they're bringing their ideas into very sophisticated roundtables and forums. No wonder the change would be radical. That means that in intellectual terms, now, if you see the paper today, if you see any paper today, you would see that there's a debate among members of experts, electoral experts, and members of the House, even members of IFE, trying to point out that perhaps to disappear the whole state structure wouldn't be the best idea. Unfortunately, I think that for the PRD and the PAN, it's extremely important to disappear these institutes. The political argument for the disappearance of these institutes lies on the fact that they feel that the governors particularly control these institutes, and on the other hand, they think that IFE is more independent. It has a history of organizing better elections, and so that's part of the debate. Just to put it in a number, the electoral reform bill that is proposed by the PAN and the PRD seeks to modify 20% of the constitutional body. It is therefore critical that all players can take sides to defend it. The presidents, who are the main heads of the local electoral institutes, have spoken out against the measure. From their point of view, the creation of an institution of this kind will damage the federal system and centralize electoral functions into a national organism. Their argument, according to my point of view, is correct. As electoral councilor, I work closely with local institutes. Therefore, I consider it's essential to create a space of dialogue between Congress and the presidents of the local electoral authorities. From my point of view, the disappearance of local electoral institutes would be a wrong decision. Moving back to centralism is not a good idea. If this argument works for taxation, it is understood that the same argument would not work for electoral matters. When the same argument is discussed among the political parties, they do not want that the governments should release this kind of attributes in a fiscal way. All discussions of democracy are inconclusive and never-ending. However, all voices and opinions must be heard to avoid an unfair decision. I could say that in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see the future of IFE. My guess is that we're going to transform into a national institute, and my guess also is that these institutes in the states are going to disappear. And if they don't disappear because of this debate, at least I would say that they would lose many of the faculties that they have nowadays. Unfortunately, and now I would like to, I tried to give you an overview of what's going on now in the Mexican Congress about this topic, but I would like to speak a little bit about the book. This book is a chronicle of what happened during the election in the year 2012, particularly of the Mexicans who live abroad, and how they had to, I would say, survive a very complicated process to vote. As you know, in Mexico, to vote, if you live abroad, you have to do it through the post. Back in other countries, that happens through the internet or through other measures. Unfortunately, the discussion that is taking place, the political reform discussion that is taking place in Congress, is not considering particularly the reform of the vote of Mexicans abroad. For me, particularly talking about this issue is not only talking about a challenge that I have lived as elections counselor and as a chairman of the respective committee during the 2012 election. The issue represents for me the opportunity to talk about a deep conviction and an ethical commitment with Mexicans living abroad. For the last 2 experiences of remote voting, Mexicans faced a complicated method that doesn't promote the desire to participate. Let me explain the problem we face it to put it in context. Back in the year 2012, 59,000 citizens registered to vote abroad, and we received only 40,000 ballots. That means that 19,000 persons didn't manage to vote actually at the end of the date, which represent an increase of 23% compared to the 2006 federal election, but less than 1%, that means less than 1% of the Mexican population living in the United States, home of the 98% of those living outside of Mexico, had the opportunity to vote. For the Mexicans abroad, voting is so hard and complicated. Mexico's electoral law has arranged for voting by mail. I would like to mention the steps to vote, and that is explained in the book. First, the citizen enrolls in the voters list by mail. Second, the enrollment reaches Mexico. Third, the citizen is validated in Mexico City. Fourth, after a few weeks, receive the ballot. Fifth, citizens make the decision. And finally, making a prayer, the Mexican abroad deposits the vote in the mailbox to send it to Mexico. If you survive all this complicated path, that maybe you could vote in the election. That means, as I was saying, that only 40,000 Mexicans could vote despite all these obstacles. I would say that they are really patriots. Can you believe the amount that the Mexican authority had to spend in the postal service? The method discourages participation. Broadly, the process of voting from abroad costed, it had a cost for the system of around $20 million, which compared to the 40,000 votes, I think it's time to change that situation. The postal voting mechanism is really primitive and absurd. It is difficult to understand a vote by post in the 21st century. Another problem faced in the voting is the voting ID. As you know, la credencial del IFE that you should have in order to vote is complicated to get, particularly if you're not living in Mexico. You gotta go into your district when you from your original address. You have to enroll in that process. You have to wait between 2 and 3 weeks, and then if you're lucky, you can get your ID and you can go back to the place where you live. That situation has to change. The Mexicans abroad can use their voting card as an ID. Currently, the voting card is the most widely used identification inside Mexico. The principal reason is the tight security measures and the use of it as a federal identity card. As you know, in Mexico, we don't have an identity card as such. So for that reason, we use the IFE card, which is extremely valued by citizens. And of course, that's something that helps us in order to improve the participation of people. To obtain the voting card, which is necessary to vote, you must go to Mexico to perform the procedure and wait a few weeks to deliver. Do you think that it's possible that a Mexican who lives in Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, or Washington will ask for some time off their job to return to Mexico and wait for some weeks to get your badge? The obvious answer is no. Mexicans abroad ask the electoral authority to collect the voting card in the place where they live. This has been one of the things that Mexican organizations all around the United States are asking. Those are some of the challenges I faced during my period as chairman of the Vote of Mexicans Abroad Commission. To share all this experience and to propose solutions to the many problems we faced in the last federal election, I decided to write this book, in which I explain vote from abroad in other nations and the struggle that took place in Congress to successfully achieve a constitutional reform. The way that Mexicans could vote was a conundrum wrapped in a riddle. The vote of Mexicans abroad was a victory late compared to other countries such as New Zealand, which introduced the first mode of voting abroad in 1890, Canada in 1915, England in 1951, and Spain in 1978. The United States introduced voting from abroad since many years ago. There are hundreds of thousands of Americans who are currently outside of their homeland. Most of them, such as military personnel, Peace Corps, volunteers, or college students, will have a permanent address in one of the 50 states or DC where they can register to vote. Back in Mexico, there are many legal obstacles and opposing voices, and it was until 1996 that was possible to change the world of Article 36 and allow to vote outside the district of residence. I would like to say that there are things that can be changed among this model, and the proposal of change is in this book, and it's also in a special study organized by a committee of experts that was hired by IFE. You can see that in the page of IFE in the internet. And the report and this book are putting some ideas of what should be changed. I would like particularly to put forward that for the first time in the history of the relationship between Mexico and the US, in January 2012, we had the opportunity to organize a forum in the University of Notre Dame in Chicago, and the representatives of the political parties in Mexico agreed to modify the way we vote from abroad, and this commitment was known as La Declaración de Chicago, or the Commitment or Declaration of Chicago. This Chicago engagement was a historic pact which took place unexpectedly in an academic event. In this pact, all the political parties agreed that the way in that Mexicans vote from abroad should be changed, and that we should introduce technology into this. For the first time, I think seriously, we are close to have an internet vote, particularly from Mexicans who live abroad. I don't foresee internet voting in Mexico within the territory because, as you know, the lack of trust among the political parties is one of the main problems that we face in the Mexican democracy. But in that sense, I would like to say that in order to provide technical solutions, IFE formed a technical committee of experts to devise a new method for remote voting. Over 5 months, the experts analyzed and evaluated proposals to modernize the vote from abroad. Among others are the possibility of processing the voting card in consulates and embassies. This would be a radical change. What the experts commission is proposing, and I also agree in that proposition is that it is possible to have an instrument through which Mexicans who live abroad, we're talking in the case of the US, that we have at least 12 million Mexicans who were born in Mexico and will have the possibility of getting the IFE card. We think that it's possible to give this card through the consulates and the embassies, not particularly consulates and embassies organizing this. We have to be the IFE because of the autonomy of the institution, but it's possible to sign some sort of agreement between the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores and the IFE. Also, one of the proposals is to voting by internet, which is secure and well accepted and has been successful in many democracies all over the world. Particularly, I think the Indian experience in the country, you know, the experience of India. India has a population of over 1,200 million Indians, and they vote through the internet. They have a voting list of around 800 million, and they have managed to organize an election through 1 week, through a solid week, and they use electronic voting. The technical, scientific, and legal work was enriched by the vision of public life actors of Mexico. Particularly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been close to us in this procedure. So, in that sense, I would say that it is possible to point out 3 main proposals that could change the way Mexicans could vote from abroad. The first one would be the possibility of getting the IFE card from any place where you live. It wouldn't be necessary to prove an address back from your country. The most important thing would be to prove that you're living abroad. That would be an essential change, because as you know, all Mexicans who are in this room now, if they want to get an IFE card, they have to prove that they live in another place. And that's a bit absurd, because you're living, let's say, there are many Mexicans who have been living, let's say, in Los Angeles for the last 20 years, and they have to prove that they live in La Colonia Narvarte in Mexico City. So that makes any sense, doesn't make any sense. So the first thing would be to prove that you live in the current place where you're living. Perhaps you have to give an old address, but just as a point of reference, not as the main address. Second, the possibility of giving all your data, if it could work with that data, and then after a while, you could receive your card. But you would receive it in the place where you live, which is a huge difference. Many Mexicans do not vote because for them it's impossible to go back to Mexico, particularly Mexicans who crossed the border into this country in an, I shouldn't say illegal, but in an undocumented way. The second thing that we're proposing is the possibility of voting through the internet. According to the study that we organized with UNAM, it is possible and secure to vote through the internet. I think that this measure could boost the possibility of voting for many Mexicans. And the third one, and I think this is very important as well, according to the Constitution and according to this model, Mexican politicians cannot come to the US or to any other country and organize political campaigns, which is a bit absurd as well, because now with the internet and all these media devices, I mean, you could see almost from anywhere what's happening in the political life of Mexico. So what I'm proposing in the book is also that it would be very important and very interesting that Mexican candidates in the election of 2018 could come to the main places. I'm thinking Chicago, LA, New York, the places where Mexicans essentially live, and we could organize, if it could organize seminars, debates, events where the actual population could have some sort of exchange with the candidates. Nowadays, it's illegal, according to the constitutions, that Mexican politicians come to, particularly to the US, and they could organize a rally, or they could have some sort of round table, which is, by the way, something that it really doesn't happen. What it really happens is that the candidates come, but they don't come such as candidates. They come as pre-candidates, they organize a round table, they discuss things, but you know, as it happens in Mexico, we don't call it campaign. I mean, they're doing some sort of campaign, but we don't call it campaign. So I guess that if we manage to change these three things, perhaps we could change the way Mexicans vote from abroad. What I would like to say finally is that we cannot continue working through this model. First, because it's extremely expensive. 4,000 voters for $20 million, I think is not a good business, it's not a good deal. Second, I think we have to boost the participation of Mexicans living in the US particularly. I would have to tell you, and this is a sad note, that in the last election we had less Mexicans voting from the US than we had in the 2006 election. We have an increase in Mexican voting in Spain, in Britain, in Canada, but that didn't happen in the United States. So that means that many Mexicans who live in the United States think that it's so complicated to vote from the place where you're living that it makes no sense to survive this bureaucratic procedure that Congress invented. So everything is in the book. I hope you can get a copy. I'm going to leave it here. If someone wants to grab one, you're happy to do it. You can download the book also from my Twitter account. It's Paco Guerrero 65A. No, Paco Guerrero A65. You can download it from there. It's free. And if you're lucky to get a copy from here, well, that would be also very nice. So I would like to finish only saying that Mexico is living again the possibility of political reform. I think it's a never-ending story. And it's a never-ending story because we keep building confidence. And when you build confidence, you have to make political reform. That's what's happening now. I'm not that sure that transforming IFE into INE, as it's been described, is such a good idea. But on the other hand, I have to recognize that the interference of governors into the performance and the function of the electoral institutes has created this demand, and I guess that Congress will have to find some sort of equilibrium to organize this political reform into the proper manner. For me, I would say that I'm finishing my period as a councillor on October the 30th after 5 years. I'm still waiting to see if Congress gets the possibility of agreeing in order to nominate the successors that will have to take place after I leave without other 4 members of the IFE. So it's these moments that we're living these moments are, I would say, critical for the future of democracy. In my case, I feel really satisfied for the work that I have managed to present to the public. We had the opportunity to organize the election 2009. We had the opportunity to organize the election 2012. Democracy in Mexico is extremely vital. It's working. As you know, here in the United States, the relationship between the president and Congress is always complicated. You know about that. There are a few things happening here, you know what I'm talking about. Back in Mexico, it doesn't happen exactly the same, but the relationship between Congress and the president is complicated. That's why this Pacto por México, this idea that political parties could work together in some sort of political reform, fiscal reform, energy reform, which is the most important reform that is being discussed now. Perhaps that's a good way to organize political power back in Mexico. I'm not extremely sure that Pacto por Mexico is going to last forever. Some say that it will be ended by the end of this year, and then, as it always happens, in October next year we have to organize the next election. We have to renew the House in 2015. But we could say that many things have changed in Mexico. Now democracy is flourishing. I think democracy is working properly. It's complicated. It's painful sometimes. And I hope that the members of the House, of the members of the Senate, take care of the recommendations that are put in the book. They take care of what the expert commission is saying. And hopefully, for many of you who perhaps would continue to live here in the United States, hopefully we could have a different model for the Mexicans living abroad. That would be everything. I appreciate very much your patience, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent, excellent presentation. I think now we're going to open it up for some questions. As you all are getting your first question prepared, maybe I'll throw one on the table for you so we can get into some dialogue and back and forth. Thank you very much. So I think my question is to keep going down this path of thinking about the centralization versus federalization and the proposal on the table for the National Electoral Institute. I guess my question is, how big of an issue do you see the state level weakness as? Not just political interference by governors, but simply the great variety of state capacity that exists throughout Mexico. And I guess the follow-on to that is, if the best solution isn't just a complete nationalization of the process, what's the alternative? I guess what's the alternative to strengthen the institutions that are in the states?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think on the federal level, and I mean, what happens in the House, what happens in the Senate, what happens in the presidency, you have checks and balances. And the checks and balances that you have work, I would say, regularly in Mexican democracy. I wouldn't be so sure the same happens in the states. I think the influence of the governors is extremely high. And according to, particularly to the PRD and the PAN, the influence that the governors have, not only in the electoral institutes, but in other branches. I'm talking about the human rights commissions, I'm talking about other institutions, autonomous institutions, that should be, let's say, equal as the function that we have in the federal level. The challenge would be to have the same nomination procedures that you have on the federal level. I mean, I'm telling you this from my experience. To be a member of IFE is extremely complicated, because you're scrutinized all the time. Transparency is always a part of the game. It doesn't happen the same in the states. Some say that governors sometimes are like little kings who work in their own region, and they don't have enough controls. But on the other hand, I think that in order to strengthen these institutions, the answer is to work particularly with Congress in the states, with the local Congress. We don't have, as you know, we don't have local senates. We only have the House, a local House in each state. I would say that the thing that you have to do in this kind of circumstances is to work closely with civil society, with NGOs, who could put pressure on what's happening, particularly in these institutions. What worries me in the solution that the Federal Congress is giving, particularly in the case of the transformation of IFE into INE, is that it seems that the easiest way is just to disappear these institutes, and that perhaps won't solve the problem, because the pressure and the political control that governors or other figures within the states could put into these new delegations of INE could be exactly the same. I mean, you don't change things only by disappearing and putting another name. I put an example. We work closely with the local institutes because we have to. We, as a federal institution, we give the enrollment list, el padrón, and we also control the transmission of spots through radio and TV. That's a federal thing that we do. But on the other hand, we have to work when we disappear. If we disappear these institutions, all the experts who work in these institutions perhaps will be hired again by the new delegation. Why? Because the experts that you have already been formed in the last, let's say, 20 years, all these institutes are between 15 and 20 years old. The people who work in these institutions are going to be the same that are going to be working in the next election, because it's impossible to grow out of nothing experts. I mean, you need experience and expertise. So I guess that one of the solutions that I've been putting forward could be, for example, that the nomination process for the members of the local institutes could be agreed in the local Congress, proposed, let's say, by the Congress, and then reviewed again by the Mexican Senate. So some sort of mixture of functions. Perhaps that could be a solution. But the reality is, and I'm going to be blunt about this, I think that for the PRI it's going to be impossible to not to disappear these institutions. I think it's a must for PAN and PRD. They think that if they don't disappear, political transition in the states won't happen. And perhaps the reason is the following. In many states of Mexico, there's no political alternations. It has never been political alternation. I'm thinking, I don't know, states like the state of Mexico, for example, Edomex. It has always been governed by the PRI. My worry here is that even if you change who's in charge of the local institute, that doesn't mean that you're going to have political alternation. I mean, I think it's a wrong idea to think that because you change who's in charge of the election, that would mean that immediately that would change political alternation. I mean, political alternation won't necessarily happen because of the will of the political parties. But in this case, because political reform has been transformed into some sort of currency in order to get other reforms, I mean, if you read the paper today, you're going to see particularly the members of the opposition parties, the PRD and the PAN, saying we won't have fiscal reform and energy reform if first we don't have political reform. So it's some sort of exchange, and that complicate things. Perhaps there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and this light could be that they find a way to strengthen these local institutions without disappearing them. That would be, for me, the best solution, because that would mean that we can work more on political strengthening of these institutions without disappearing them. If we disappear them, what is going to happen is that all people working in these institutions are going to move to the IFE, and they're going to be working with us anyway. What is going to change is the way in which IFE nominates the delegates of IFE into the states. So as you can see, it's not an easy answer. It's a tricky question.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yeah, Margaret? Yeah. We have a microphone. Let me just...
Thank you. Could you, a comment, it seems to me strange that the PRD and the PAN would think that that alternation would occur, or that they would not be just dominated by whoever controls the INE in this change. So could you talk a little bit about how the councilors of INE are selected, are nominated, and how that differs at the state level and some of the changes you propose?
Yeah.
And if you could just briefly introduce yourself, just...
I'm sorry, I'm Margaret Daly Hayes.
So many of us know you, but thank you.
Okay. I teach Latin American issues at Georgetown.
Thank you. Well, Margaret, this is also an interesting question. There's no such a difference between the process to nominate consejeros from IFE and consejeros from electoral institutes in the states. In all the cases, you have to be the name of the councillor has to be put forward through a political party. That's what the Constitution says. They have to propose names, and then they have to go through a very complicated process, and they have to be voted by 2/3 of the House. In the case of the Federal Institute, through the House of the Cámara de Diputados. The same happens in the electoral institutes. There's no such a difference. Perhaps the difference is that the performance of the consejeros of IFE is extremely scrutinized, is reviewed all the time through the national media, and the same doesn't happen in the states. I would put a difference that is also interesting. The political debate in the national media is always very tough, it's complicated, as you know, and perhaps the journals and the newspapers and TV and radio in the States are not as free as they are on the national level. Let's say the political debate on the national level is more complicated, and the debate in the States, according to what the opposition say, they say that in many ways media could be controlled in the States, and the same doesn't happen at the federal level. So perhaps it's a matter of visibility, it's a matter of political pressure on the members of this institute. But on the other hand, when you see political alternation in other states, I want to put some examples. The state of Puebla, for example, it was ruled originally by the PRI, and then the candidate of the opposition, it was a candidate of all the political parties. He won despite that the institution, the local institute, the local electoral institute, was created through a PRI government. So I don't see the connection. Perhaps, and this is something for the shrink, I guess, because political parties are extremely critical of the work of IFE. But every time that political reform comes, they want to put more responsibilities on IFE, even if they are critical of the work. So I guess that perhaps the opposition is betting on the fact that if the members of this new institute are institutionally attached to the center, to Mexico City, there could be more control because they wouldn't be nominated by the governors or by the political parties in the states. They would be part of a huge. Nowadays, IFE has around 15,000 workers, and the domestic institutes, they are around also like 15,000. So the first thing that the new institution is going to make is going to try to it will have to do it because it is going to be according to the law, is that they would have to terminate the labor condition, the labor terms of the relationship between the workers who have already a contract in the electoral institutes in every state. So that's going to cost a lot of money. So that's why I'm not that sure that this bet is going to be cheaper for the country. It's politically correct in terms of if you see it through the eyes of the opposition. But also we have to recognize that although we have the same procedures in order to nominate and elect the members, the pressure on IFE is extremely high, and perhaps the same doesn't happen with the domestic institutes. I don't know if it was clear, but that's the Mexican reality.
Thanks.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there any requirement for representation of all of the parties or a majority party or large plurality parties on IFE? Or, I mean, could the IFE be dominated by a single party?
No, actually the members of the consejeros, the councilors of IFE, have to be citizens who have been away from political parties at least for 5 years. They cannot belong to, or you can belong, but you cannot be a member, an active member of the institution. Actually, the historic change prior to the creation of IFE was that the government was in charge of elections. Now the election is now citizens are in charge of election. And just one final thing. In Mexico, 1 million Mexicans are the ones in charge of organizing the election. It's not even the members of IFE. IFE takes care of the training and the teaching of the abilities in order to establish the voting table, but it's 1 million Mexicans who are in charge of organizing the election.
Jaime, okay.
Thank you. Ruben Barrera with the Mexican News Agency, Notimex. I have a lot of questions, but I will stick to one. Obviously, democracy is imperfect, and I think that we could apply that to Mexico. I mean, Mexico is still learning to live on democracy. But my question is, you talk about the pros and cons of this electoral reform, and I wonder if after all the things that you had seen and read, can you consider this to be reform that it may result in a strong electoral system in Mexico, especially taking in consideration that this reform is being discussed without any civil society input, basically the parties are the ones who's going to make, the new law. And it makes me wonder, if, this reform could really reflect all the aspiration of Mexican, because, for example, you say that you expect that this month or next month, the discussion will include also the re-election. But I didn't hear anything so far about eliminating this figure of proportional representation, which basically just result in a large bunch of bureaucrats in both houses, and some of them they just taking advantage of this to make a life living on politics because they don't have to face an election. They just want to wait for the big finger to see if they're going to have another 3 or 6 years living at government expenses.
Well, I would say that, first of all, the role of NGOs and the role of civil society as such, and when I say civil society, I refer to the citizens. The role of citizens in the construction, the building of political reform in Mexico is still very poor. I mean, we would say that essentially this political reform is a political reform that is in the interest of the political parties. I mean, that's for sure. I would say that if you analyze the history of political reform in Mexico, you would see that political reform occurs after the presidential election. And for example, political reform of 2007 and 2008 was the result of the political crisis of the election of 2006 on President Calderon. This election is particularly, I think this political reform is the result of the insatisfaction and the unhappiness, particularly of two political parties, among some rules that have been applied for many years. I'm talking particularly about spending. You know that spending is always complicated, and there was a huge debate in Mexico about the way that this fiscalization or the checks and balances of spending was taken care of. The case of re-election or of the second round or many other political reforms that are included here, of course, are part of the worries of the political parties. Unfortunately, and I would agree with you in a way. Unfortunately, civil society, universities, the intellectual circles are not part of this discussion yet. And this is something that worries me also, and because this exchange between political reform, fiscal reform, and energy reform, it would seem that, as it has been said, particularly by two political parties, they'd say, if we don't have political reform, we won't discuss the other reforms. So that's something that it's worrying, and I would say that, as you know, because you're Mexican, as you know, I think that the role of civil society and the role of particularly of citizens in this discussion is still something that has to be improved in the years to come. Now, in terms of re-election, as you know, re-election is not popular among the citizens because of historical reasons. We back in Mexico have this tendency, if a Mexican gets in power for more than 6 years, then he thinks that the chair belongs to him. And, Porfirio Diaz and many other historical expressions. But on the other hand, I would say that re-election would be a good measure in order to improve checks and balances within the Mexican political system. But I don't see that connection yet. And one of the, let's say that the missing links in Mexican democracy nowadays is that I guess that citizens should be more connected with what's happening in Congress. They could have more communication with the representatives, but that is something that has to happen in the years to come. That doesn't happen even in strong democracies. But in the case of Mexico, I guess that to answer your question, yeah, this is a political reform that is designed by the political parties, and it would be fantastic to have more input from the citizens.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, and then Ted.
Good morning, Doctor. I'm Luis Enrique Mireles, a law degree from Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. I agree with you that it would be very dangerous and difficult to centralize all power of electoral power of the federation in the INE. I agree. I totally agree with you. But I would like to know your opinion about an interesting points of this political reform, like the option that the INE could control the money and expense of the political parties, and to achieve supervise them, and the option to cancel election for exceeding this cost. This is my question.
Well, of course, expenditure and the control of expenditure is, I think, one of the most important things about this reform. The problem in the states has been that, for example, many of them hire private firms in order to go through the auditing of these expenses. We in IFE, we don't do that. We do it through the institution that we have. We have a Unidad de Fiscalización, a particular one that belongs to IFE, and I think it has improved a lot in the terms of controlling expenditure. I would say that I would agree in a national expenditure control. I mean, I think it would be good. Now, canceling the election because of expenditure is something that should be studied seriously. Imagine that for a reason, someone wins the election, let's say for 7 million votes, and then after he wins the election or she wins the election is cancelled because according to the results of the expenditure control institution, he overspent or she overspent. I mean, that had never happened back in Mexico. It's a possibility that happens. So that puts that should, if that measure is put into consideration, it has to be taken very seriously. And everybody, all the political parties should agree that the institution in charge of doing that should be backed politically by Congress and by all the political parties, because otherwise that would diminish the political strength of the Mexican who is elected president. So I think it's a complicated measure. It has never happened, and that could happen perhaps. There's a measure that is being put forward in that sense that says that all expenditure should be controlled by IFE or INE. That would mean to remove the money from the political parties, and that then the IFE or INE would be the one in charge of expenditure. That would mean to pay all the bills. I don't know if political parties are really into that. I don't know. According to my experience, that could be tough for them. But perhaps that could be good. At the end of the day, I think, and this is one of the things that I've learned after 5 years in IFE, I think is that the lack of trust among the political parties is the main problem that we're still facing. As long as they keep this lack of trust among each other, that I think that is not good for the institutions, because at the end of the day, even when you lose an election by 6 million, 7 million votes, you don't accept the result. If you see in the last 25 or 30 elections in the States, it doesn't matter if you lose by, let's say, 20 points, you still go to the tribunal and you say this was an unfair election and so on and so forth. And so Mexican citizens know that even if you lose, you're going to go to the institution anyway. And that's a change in the political will of political parties. That's not a legal reform. That's not something that it has to be. That's in the head, you know. That's a mind change that should occur. But well, we're working on it. And I guess if you compare the election 2012 with the election 2006, I mean, 2012 was great compared to what happened in 2006 in terms of confidence and in terms of, I mean, for the good of the country, on December the 2nd of last year, you had, I would like to be positive, you know, you had all the political parties seated in the same table, and they organized the Pacto por México. And that has been good for the country, according to my point of view, because we had the possibility of moving forward after the election in a more proper manner. Now, to answer your question, I think it's going to be tricky to find a mechanism that guarantees that you have a tight control on expenditure, and if that means that the party that spends more is going to lose the possibility of winning, I mean, that's a tough choice. So it has to be prepared in a proper manner. Because if you do that on the federal level, on the national level, you're going to do the same in elecciones for presidentes municipales, gobernadores, diputados locales, presidentes auxiliares. I mean, it's a tough call.
Thanks. Let's try one from this side of the room. This side's been winning so much, but we'll have time to get to.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Julia Yenser. I work on migration and remittances at the Inter-American Dialogue. I was really interested in your mention of the procedures that make it difficult for Mexicans in the United States to vote. And your recommendations for ways that we could modernize or improve their participation were really interesting. However, I'm wondering if there's any concern about including such a huge 12 million, you mentioned, Mexicans living in the US in the political process. Someone who's been living in the US for 10, 20 years might have very different beliefs or priorities than Mexicans voting from Mexico. Have you seen any concern or trepidation among the political parties about including this population, or would you say that they are enthusiastic about doing so? Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, of course, the answer is that political parties are extremely cautious about this because the expectation that we had in the year 2006, perhaps some of you remember that situation. Many thought that because there were, at that time, let's say 9 million Mexicans, you would have a show up of 1 million, 1.5 million voters. The reality is that we have 32,000. Why? Because it's complicated for Mexicans to vote. Even if you're interested in what's happening in Mexico. I mean, I could say that now, tonight, when Mexico plays against Costa Rica, you're going to have 10, 12 million Mexicans, 20 million Mexicans watching the game. I mean, they are connected to what's happening in Mexico. And perhaps they are connected to what's happening in on the political aspect. But for them, it's complicated to vote because first, it's complicated for them to get the ID. Second, when they have the ID, to send 3 times, I mean, it's crazy. I guess that if you can do it through the internet and you can get your ID card in a more fashionable way, the participation is going to improve. But I don't see a dramatic improvement. I mean, I'm not saying that you're going to have, let's say, out of 12, now, according to our data, we have 5 million Mexicans who have the ID. Of course, this ID ran out of, it's not working anymore in Mexico, but it's working. You can use it from the States. But let's say that you could have at least, I wouldn't like to say a number, but you wouldn't have 42,000. I think you could improve, let's say, to 500,000 or so. Now, this raises some questions for Mexican political parties. Particularly, I think PAN and PRD are more eager to develop this. The government perhaps is more cautious, but now that they are in the government, perhaps they could have more interest in having this mechanism. And I would say the following. Politically speaking, all the parties say that they agree to change the mechanism because it's politically correct. But in real terms, I would like to see this happening, and I'm not that sure that it's going to happen because it's so far away. The next presidential election is in the year 2018. So there are some concerns, but I wouldn't see millions and millions of Mexican voting. I would see an increase in participation because I had the possibility of travel around the U.S., and Mexicans are extremely eager to participate. I mean, they want to participate. But first they have the obstacles, and if they didn't have that obstacle, perhaps, I guess that the internet voting, particularly for the younger generations, could be something that could boost participation. But there are concerns, and that's why the thing moves so slowly.
I think Ted was waiting for a minute, and then we'll grab you next.
Thank you. Is this one?
Yeah.
I'm Ted Wilkinson, Foreign Service Institute. Going back to spending, Trevor Potter, who is the former chairman of our Federal Electoral Council, had us an article this weekend saying the Supreme Court should stay out of trying to decide or trying to walk back regulations that limit spending by individuals in our campaigns and leave it to the politicians. He's probably the only person who's saying leave anything to the politicians this week. However, we don't have a trife. We don't have a court that adjudicates election disputes. You do. Mexico does. To what extent is trife now empowered to impose sanctions on violations, and to what extent, if any, would it change under the reforms?
Yeah. Well, trife is a very powerful tool in in Mexican democracy. Actually, trife could cancel an election because of expenditure, let's say violations. It had never happened. Trife has canceled elections because of other reasons, because of political reasons, because of lack of transparency or because of fraud, but it has never done that because of public spending problems. Perhaps one of the difference between the U.S. and Mexico in this part is that it seems that in the U.S. Spending in campaigns is more liberal in a way. Back in Mexico, individuals do not participate that much. I mean, citizens as such, it's complicated. I don't know the Mexicans who are with me now, but I don't know many Mexicans who say, I'm going to give to this political party or this candidate money. I'm talking about regular citizens, not corporations or the other kind of institutions. But in the case of public spending, trife is very powerful, and they remain as the tribunal, as the court who could reverse the triumph of someone in case that public spending goes up or is beyond the limits. So trife has this possibility. I have to remember that IFE, or INE in the future, is the body in charge of organizing the election. But the one that gives the certificate of triumph or the final result is trife. And in this reform, what they're trying to do also is to disappear. I didn't talk about that, but I'm going to mention it briefly. What they're trying to do now is to disappear local tribunals who are in charge of each of each state. So that's also something that could happen. The idea is to centralize everything. So trife would be even more powerful in that way, because they would have to impose the legislation, particularly in terms of spending. Let me finish by saying that what is happening in terms of spending back in Mexico, I think is pushing the limits to a point where in the next election, I foresee something complicated for the democracy, because if someone proves that someone spent more than the other candidates, which is always complicated to know, because as you know, one thing is the numbers that you have in the books, and something different is the money that runs through political campaigns, particularly in a country like Mexico. So that's going to be something that has to be taken into consideration in a very proper manner. In our current situation, when trife had to give President Peña his certificate that he won, they according to the current law, it was impossible for trife to know what happened with the public spending, because public spending would be reviewed 1 year after the election was ended. So it didn't have any consequences. Now they want to impose these consequences prior to the arrival of the president. So in principle, I could agree with that idea. I just want to see the details. Because if you don't see the details, that could paralyze the political system. So it's complicated.
Interesting. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Jesus Lopez. I'm a PhD student from University of Guadalajara. I have two questions related to the Mexicans abroad. The first one is, how is Mexican diaspora making pressure on Mexican politicians, I mean political parties, to be included in the new political reform? And the second is, which are the most influential or active organizations in promoting the vote of Mexicans abroad?
Thank you, Jesus. Well, pressure. Yeah, there are many groups of Mexicans living abroad, particularly, I would say, in California, in Chicago, some of them are in New York, particularly organized group from Michoacán, from Zacatecas, from Puebla, who are putting pressure. But unfortunately, the pressure that they put into these kind of things, when they go to Mexico, all the political parties have a meeting with them, they talk to them, they tell them that they're going to change the law, and they have been doing that for 6 years with no results. So perhaps the difference now is that when I wrote this book and we organized the group of experts about the need of changing the legislation, that has been a topic that it has been increasing its participation in public media, but is not still a topic that worries Mexicans. I mean, Mexicans in the streets in Mexico City or in many other cities in Mexico are not particularly worried about the participation of Mexicans abroad. So I think that there's a lack of lobbying from these Mexican groups who live in the US. They have to build more bridges of understanding with Mexican Congress in order to put forward their aim. I've been trying, and I think I've been a bit successful in that way. I've been trying to be a voice of these groups back in Mexico, because I have the chance of talking to members of Congress. As a member of the IFE, I have the possibility of putting forward these kind of ideas. But I think the lack of organization of Mexicans who live in the US and the way that they travel to Mexico and put pressure on Mexican Congress is still in a very early stage. I mean, you don't see the same kind of political pressure that, let's say, Dominicans, people from the Dominican Republic, or from Colombia, or from Venezuela, put into the governments and the representatives. I think there's still a disconnection of what's happening. They fight very hard. I was just in LA last week, and we had a chance to talk to them. They saw the book. We're working together in order to change the model. But unfortunately, this topic back in Mexico, it's important in terms of political correctness. I mean, everybody says, yeah, let's change it, but nobody does anything about it. So that's part of the tragedy on this topic.
We're nearing the end of our time, but I think we have time for one more question if you want to.
Hi, Emma Buckout from NDN. I work on a 21st Century Border Initiative. So along those lines, is there any viability, do you think, of sort of establishing some sort of branch of the IFE or the INE in the US, sort of in conjunction with embassies or consulates, or some sort of cross-border organization that could do that, as we're starting to try and open up the economic dialogue and the others, sort of a US-Mexico collaboration?
There's some presence of the IFE in the consulates already.
Okay.
Also,
Yeah.
is right? Can you tell us about that?
That's a very interesting question. It's a must. If you want to improve the way Mexicans vote from abroad, I think it's a must to work closely with the United States, and particularly to have some sort of Mexican representation of IFE or INE in the US. We had a pilot program that worked quite well. We hired through a private institution, we hired like 60 people who were working in each consulate, particularly in the most important ones, I would say Chicago, LA, Atlanta, etc. And their job was, during the enrollment, to talk to have let's say a small office in each consulate or in the embassy, and to work with people directly. because you know, for many Mexicans, it's a bit complicated to go and enroll. You have to give your name, you have to give your address, and particularly for many Mexicans, that thing of giving your address, perhaps they come from La Migra, and I'm not that sure that I should be doing that. Perhaps it's dangerous or complicated, but that worked very well because now we have a database that we didn't have. Now, if this goes through the internet, which is the main proposal of this book, is that the next election, the next presidential election for Mexicans abroad, the way to vote should be through the internet. You imagine technology in the year 2018. I guess that internet is going to be even easier than it is now. You should have to organize some sort of representation. Now, that's extremely expensive, and that's one of the concerns that I've been facing when you discuss this with Congress. But of course, it's easier to hire personnel or to hire even members of the community to work in a proper manner than to maintain the postal vote, which is extremely, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I don't see postal vote for the next election because it's extremely expensive. Someone says, one joking, that it would have been easier to pay the Mexicans who voted and to bring them back to Mexico, you know? Just for 2 days, come back, we pay you the hotel and the plane, and then you go back to your country, to the country where you're living with. That would be perhaps, I think it's not a nice joke, but in terms of the, if you compare how much you're investing and how much you're getting, I mean, $20 million for 40,000 votes, I mean, it's not a good business. So I guess that should change. But yeah, I see something like that is going to happen, particularly in the cities where you have a large population. I would think LA, I would think Chicago, I would think New York, I would think Atlanta, other places, then you should have this sort of representation, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. One more time, an applause for you.
Thank you.
Councilor, you're very generous with your time, very frank in your answers to us. It was really an enlightening discussion. We really appreciate it. Thank you. I want to also thank the embassy, Alexandra Haas from the embassy, for helping us coordinate this visit. Really appreciate your support always. Thanks to all of you for coming out today. As you see, the government may be shut down, but the Wilson Center is still open. So, so keep coming back. We'll be doing more things. Pay attention. And if someone wants, we have some
there
books.
There are some books over there. If someone wants
as you mentioned,
to get one, please feel free. I leave you also this.